Now for a somber topic. It was a bad war, that Yom Kippur War. It cost Israel 3,000 dead, the largest number of casualties that Israel, dead casualties that Israel had experienced in any of its wars, with the exception of the war of 1948, when the Israelis lost 6,000 dead. So we are talking about a war, and a war, like all wars, really had enormous impact upon the belligerents and even people far beyond the Middle East. War is the midwife of change, and the Middle East changed a great deal as a consequence of the Yom Kippur War. For those of you that have heard me before, you know, especially I said this on Friday night. I quoted a French historian who said, "You cannot explain the present by the present. There's always a history of a particular event." So if the present for us is October 6th of 1973, then one has to look at the origins of that war. Now, I begin by telling you something that I think everyone should know, and I suspect that most of you do know. There can be no understanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict unless you factor in 1948. For us, 1948 is a glorious year. For us, and particularly for Israelis, it is the war of liberation. A Jewish state, the first one in almost 2,000 years, was created. For the Arabs in particular, and Muslims in general, it is al-Nakba. It is the catastrophe. It is not only the fact that the Arabs were defeated, not only that probably around 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, it is also a stain on the honor of Islam as perceived by Muslims all over the world. After all, the Arabs outnumbered the Jews in terms of, I'll give you the population figures, in 1948, there were 650,000 Jews living in Palestine. There were over 1 million, probably 1,200,000 Arabs living in Palestine, and 40 million Arabs living in countries Arab countries surrounding Palestine. How could this be? How could it possibly be? In addition to that, there was, again, the religious factor as well. In the eyes of Islam, we are Dehimis. We are, together with the Christians, we are Dehimis. That literally means protected people. In the eyes of Islam, Judaism and Christianity are legitimate but inferior religions. It is fair to say, and one always has to be as fair as can be, that for hundreds of years you can make an accurate statement. It was far better to be a Jew living under Islam than it was to be a Jew living under the Christians. The Muslims historically were far more tolerant, certainly in the golden age of Islam. But even in that golden age, even in Moorish Spain, Jews had to know their place. We were not allowed to perform certain occupations, we could not bear weapons, and as any tour guide in Jerusalem worth his or her salt would tell you, that in the Islamic world, no synagogue could ever really be built larger than a mosque. We were unable to proselytize. Again, life was good for the most part. For the most part, there were pogroms, or the equivalent of pogroms in the Islamic world, but nothing like the slaughters that took place that our people experienced in the Christian world. So the question is, how can a Dehimi people, how could they possibly have beaten us? And finally, of course, as everybody should know, that Temple Mount, which is holy for us, is holy for them as well. To lose the Dome of the Rock, to lose El-Aqsa, to lose the Temple Mount, which the Islamic tradition says is from the mount that Muhammad ascended to heaven. To lose this to a Dehimi people is a disgrace, a stain on the honor of Islam. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that ever since 1948, there's always a longing for a second round. And there was a second round, and that was in 1956. That's the 96-hour war. And once again, the Arabs were defeated. And therefore, There's a look for a third round. And there was a third round. And the third round was in 1967, where in fact the most ignominious of the Arab defeats took place. There's nothing, here's a Berk's law, there's nothing like a humiliating loss in war to force a country to take a hard look, a very hard look, and ask the tough questions. Why did we lose? And what do we have to do to make sure that we're not going to lose again? What this means is, when it is all over, and when in 1971 the Prince of Darkness visits Nasser, and a new leader comes to power, Anwar Sadat, there's going to be a rethinking. To put it as succinctly as I can, the Egyptians, not the Israelis, will learn the lessons of the Six-Day War. Lenin used to say, he would be astonished, turning over in the mausoleum, to think that I'm quoting him before a Jewish audience. Not that Lenin was an anti-Semite. Stalin was, but Lenin was not. Lenin used to say, I even tell it to my students, one who has lost is worth 10 who have won. That is, if you lose, you suck it up, as we would say, you take the long, tough, and critical view of your own position, and you begin to prepare for the next round. The Egyptians prepared for the next round. They were humiliated. They had to recover at least some of what had been lost in the Six-Day War. So what do? They begin to look at the disparity. That is, what do the Israelis have and what do we have? The Israelis have always had, ever since 48, but not in 48, really domination of the air. That is, the Egyptians were going to have to find a way to neutralize that great Israeli Air Force. And they found a way. They received from their Soviet allies very sophisticated ground-to-air missiles. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Very successful. And the Egyptians did something that the Israelis did not do. Not only did they look at their experience in the Six-Day War, they looked at the American experience in the Vietnam War. And what they learned is that American air power was to a very large extent, at least fighter air power, ground support air power, was in fact neutralized by the ground-to-air missiles that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had, the same missiles that came from the Soviet Union that were now being placed in the hands of the Egyptians. In addition to that, the Israelis had something else. Israeli ground forces were superbly trained, and the Israeli advantage on the ground was that very, very fine tank force that the Israelis had. The Israelis had lots of tanks, and they had to be neutralized as well. And once again, the Egyptians learned from the Soviets, and indeed from the Vietnam experience, that there was an escalation in the efficacy of anti-tank weapons. It was no longer the realm of the bazooka. There were now anti-tank missiles that the Soviets had, and they were now transferred to the Egyptians. Another lesson that they learned was there is no substitution for large numbers of forces concentrated in a small area. When the attack comes, 600,000 Egyptian soldiers will participate in the attack. In 1973, that was more soldiers than the combined armies that NATO had on the European continent. So a concentration of large numbers of soldiers. Also, there had to be a steady resupply. Soviet ships set sail from Soviet ports before the war began, meaning that they would arrive when the war began and in the midst of the war, resupplying the Egyptian forces. That's very, very important as well. But the most significant and probably the most skillful thing that the Egyptians engaged in was a very, very sophisticated misinformation or disinformation campaign. Articles began to appear. They were placed. There were enough people in England and all over the world that was sympathetic to the Arab side, and some journalists were taken in. We began to read articles that the Egyptian army was in disarray, that the Egyptians had conflicts with the Soviets, that the Soviets, in fact, were pulling people out. The feeling or the impression that was conveyed that if war comes, it is not coming for a long period of time. Those who have studied the Yom Kippur War, again, this is the 40th anniversary, have said that perhaps the most important element in the preparation was this misinformation campaign, really, that was projected by the Egyptians. The Israelis were taken in. Now, let's look at the other side. What's happening on the Israeli side? One of the best commentators on the history of Israel, the book is dated now. The book was written at the end of the 1980s. It is the book by Conor Cruz O'Brien, the great Irish literary figure. It is a book I think is entitled The Siege. And what O'Brien said, O'Brien was a literary person, the bird of hubris flew from Baghdad and Amman and from Cairo and landed in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. In short, the Israelis were filled, at the very, very least, if one wants to be kind, with a great deal of overconfidence. The Israelis had whipped, really whipped, the Egyptians and the Syrians in the Six-Day War. They were overconfident to the point, and there may even have been a racist component in here, a belief that the Egyptians had neither the courage nor the skill to mount a successful attack. Also, the Israeli intelligence had told Golda Meir that war would come. The Egyptians would eventually make war, but the war would not come for some time. At the earliest, it would come in 1975, because the Israelis seemed to have swallowed a good deal of that misinformation, despite the fact that the Israelis had something that my country would have loved to have in dealing with Saddam Hussein and dealing with, of course, Iran at the present time. You can talk until you're blue in the face about technology, about spy satellites. There is nothing as good, any intelligence operative will tell you this, there is nothing as good as having one of your spies highly placed in the upper echelons of the enemy government. The United States did not have it with Saddam Hussein, and I'm not sure we have it in dealing with Iran. But the Israelis had it in Cairo. The Israelis had a spy that was highly placed. That spy was the son-in-law of Nasser, and he was on the payroll of the Mossad. And he was telling them, war is coming, and war is coming soon. The Israelis did not pay much attention to that. In addition to that, let me just say to you, for those of you that like historical analogies, the analogy is with the Soviet Union in the pre-June 22nd, 1941 period. June 22nd is the date of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin received intelligence. He had a spy. The greatest spy and the most important spy of the 20th century was Richard Sorge. He was a German communist who was sent on assignment to Tokyo, penetrated the German embassy with the Japanese Communist Party, and gave Stalin the information about the impending German attack. Stalin disregarded all of that information. So in Stalin's case, it's personality. In the Israeli case, it is hubris and overconfidence. The Israelis did not learn anything from the Vietnam War. The Israelis were convinced that they could, to use the expression, clean the Egyptian clock, and that was really a mistake. The two other things that the Egyptians did was to, again, coordinate with the Syrians, much greater coordination than was done in the Six-Day War, and also they prepared a weapon that if things went badly, well, they could be bailed out. The weapon was the oil embargo. There was a pre-existing agreement before the war that, in fact, the Arab states, particularly the Saudis, would really restrict the sale of oil to the United States and to American allies. The Israelis became aware only on the morning of October 6th, did Israeli intelligence finally confirm that war was going to come and war was imminent. In the preceding days, again as part of the misinformation campaign, Egyptian and Syrian forces moved to forward lines. The Israelis mobilized a little bit, and then the Egyptian and Syrian forces moved back. They did this 2 or 3 times. The Israeli response was, these are just feints. This is part of the misinformation. And since the Israeli army is largely a reserve army, that the Egyptians and the Syrians were really only doing this to weaken the Israeli economy. When a number of Israeli generals, David al-Azhar, for example, the chief of staff, argued that Israel should mobilize lots of men, Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir probably said no. We know they said no. Don't, this will be provocative, and so on. And there is something else. There's so much to say about that pre-October 6th attack. What we do not know, but it may have taken place. Everybody knows the Israelis, before they go to war, really try and coordinate or get that proverbial green light from the United States. Levi Eshkol delayed and delayed in May and June of 67 until he got what he thought was at least a hint at a green light from Lyndon Johnson. Here's the controversy. Did Henry Kissinger, the American Secretary of State, did he somehow convince or convey to Anwar Sadat that if you want negotiations between you and the Israelis, and you want at least part of the Sinai back, then don't come to me. You got to bleed the Israelis. The Israelis will not make concessions unless they are forced to bleed, unless they bleed. Did Kissinger say that? Not in the words, this man is too sophisticated a diplomat, not to say it in the way I presented it. But there is some evidence, there are a number of commentators that say he gave, in one fashion or other, that proverbial green light. We do not know. We'll talk about Kissinger's role again and again in this particular lecture. The only thing, and here is where you got to know the culture, the only thing that the Egyptians did wrong, and it will prove very, very costly to them, they should have known better. They should have somehow paid a Jewish advisor to tell him that, or someone who knew Israel better. It is far better, if you are going to launch an attack upon Israel, launch the attack on Rosh Hashanah, not on Yom Kippur. Even secular Israelis show up in the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and if they don't show up in the synagogue, they stay at home. On Rosh Hashanah, in a country that is largely secular, for those of you that have been there, large numbers, by the hundreds of thousands, Israelis go to the beach. They go down to Eilat, they go to the beaches. The fact that the attack took place on Yom Kippur will make it, and this is of the greatest importance, it will make it much, much easier for the Israelis to mobilize that reserve army. That's an important point. The Egyptians got everything right except for that, and it will cost them dearly. The morning of October 6th, again, Israeli intelligence finally confirms that the attack is imminent. An intense discussion goes on between Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, David al-Azhar, and the Mossad. What do we do now? Elazar says, not only do we order a full mobilization, but most important of all, Israel has to launch a preemptive strike. That is, if we strike now, we can disrupt them, at the very least, weaken their attack, and probably, maybe even, dissuade them from making an attack. Golda rejects this. So does Moshe Dayan. Again, the reason being, again, we're not altogether sure of this. Two things probably came into play. One, again, Israeli hubris. So we'll take the first hit. We'll take it. We'll take it, and then we'll smash them and go over to the offensive. And also, again, you must never forget this, and I say this not out of American chauvinism. Israel is always reluctant to move without the United States. And the feeling that we have, the evidence that we have is that Secretary of State Kissinger is telling the Israelis, do not launch a preemptive strike. And again, from the Israeli perspective, you cannot antagonize the Americans. That, I must tell you, is a consistent element in Israeli foreign policy. Even Netanyahu understands this. You can't antagonize Washington, whether it's a Republican president or a Democratic president. The nature of the dependency is so great, you can't tick off the United States. Is this what leads Golden not to launch the preemptive attack? Is it that Israeli hubris? Whatever it may be, there is no Israeli preemptive attack. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Egyptians and the Syrians attack. And the Egyptians demonstrate a flair. That is something that they had not demonstrated earlier. The Israelis had piled up huge mountains of sand right in front of the Bar Lev line, the Israeli defensive forces on the, let's say, the eastern side of the Suez Canal. The Egyptians had bought high-pressure and high-powered hoses. They shoot those hoses, the sand dissipates, the mountains of sand, and the Egyptian forces roll over. Perhaps the greatest example of Israeli hubris is that I told you that 600,000 Egyptian soldiers will participate in the attack. The total number of Israeli forces in the Bar Lev line was less than 800. In short, the Israelis think they can hold it off, probably thinking there will not be an attack in the first place, thinking that if there is an attack, they can hold off long enough in order to bring up the reserves. The Egyptians crash through. The Israelis are forced back. The Syrians mount an attack on the Golan Heights and, in fact, penetrate very, very deeply. Haifa is in danger. For the first time in a long time, in a confrontation with the Arab states, an Israeli city, a large Israeli city, is in trouble. Now, to cut to the chase, without getting into great detail in the war, the fact that Israel survives all of this is primarily a consequence of the pluck, the courage, and the skill of Israeli soldiers. That is, mistakes are made. That is, as the Egyptians cross the canal, the Israelis will hit them. The counteroffensive will be frittered away before massive reserves are brought up. That is a mistake. What you do, at least in retrospect, you take the hit, you withdraw to a position from which you can easily defend, and you wait for the reserves to pull in. But the Israelis did not do that. They sent attacks prematurely, and those attacks would again be repulsed by the Egyptians. But there is no question, those Israeli soldiers in the Sinai, wherever the mistakes were made by the high command, they will show a great deal of pluck and a great deal of courage. Also, on the Golan Heights, Haifa is in danger. But again, 180 Israeli tanks will fight the Assyrians to a standstill, again withdrawing, but fighting them to a standstill, giving Israel precious time to mobilize the reserves. In addition to that, there were some skilled actions taken by Israeli commanders, the most skillful of them all, Ariel Sharon, who was able to eventually cross the canal.